France, 1789. The old world is cracking at its foundations. The streets of Paris are slick with rain and something darker. The air thick with smoke, with rage, with the sound of a civilization tearing itself apart at the seams. Thrones are toppling. Ancient bloodlines are being severed with cold, mechanical efficiency. The earth itself seems to tremble beneath the weight of something enormous, something irreversible. And into this collapse, this terrifying, magnificent rupture in the story of the Western world, a young man steps forward. He is not from Paris. He is not from the gilded salons of aristocrats or the marble corridors of inherited power. He comes from a small, rugged island in the Mediterranean, Corsica, a place the rest of Europe barely acknowledged. He speaks French with a foreign accent. His family is minor nobility, impoverished, overlooked. He carries nothing but a ferociously sharp mind, and a hunger so immense, so unrelenting, that the old world was simply never built to contain it. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. He will redesign the map of Europe with a general's ink and a conqueror's hand. He will command armies of 500,000 men across frozen Russian steppes and sun-scorched Egyptian deserts. He will draft a legal code still embedded in the foundations of dozens of nations today. He will stand inside Notre Dame de Paris, take the imperial crown from the hands of the Pope himself, and place it on his own head, because that is precisely and entirely who Napoleon Bonaparte is. And yet, the questions that settle in the quiet dark of history are heavy ones. How does a minor noble from a remote, isolated island bend an entire continent to his will? Is supreme ambition a warming fire, one that pulls a broken nation up from chaos and blood into something new and enduring? Or is that same ambition a conflagration, one that ultimately consumes everything it has ever touched, including the very man who lit the flame? 2 centuries after his death, we are still here, in the dark, whispering his name. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep Stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day. The island of Corsica does not ask for your permission. It does not soften itself for the traveler, or the visitor, or the child born beneath its granite sky. It is a place of maquis scrubland and sharp mountain ridges, of feuds settled in silence, and of a people who have known for centuries what it means to be owned by someone else. The Genoese sold the island to France in 1768. 1 year later, on the 15th of August, 1769, in the coastal city of Ajaccio, a woman named Letitia gave birth to her second surviving child. She named him Napoleon. The French would eventually call him Napoleon. The world would simply call him Bonaparte. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer of moderate means and considerable ambition, a minor noble who understood, with the practical eyes of a provincial, that the future for his children lay not on this rugged island, but on the mainland of France, inside the institutions of the very empire that had swallowed Corsica whole. He documented the family's slender claim to noble ancestry. He petitioned and wrote letters and waited. And when Napoleon was 9 years old, Carlo's persistence was at last rewarded. The boy would be sent to France. Think for a moment about what that means. A 9-year-old child pulled from the only world he has ever known, from the smell of salt air and dry scrub, from the rapid, clipped rhythms of the Corsican dialect from the comforting weight of family, placed on a ship, and delivered to a foreign country. He arrived at the preparatory school in Autun in January of 1779. He spoke almost no French. The other children heard his accent, his strange soft vowels, his Italian cadence, and they laughed. They called him the foreigner. They said he was not truly French. The boy from Ajaccio said very little in return. He had already learned in the way that only the mocked and displaced ever truly learn, that words spoken in defense are wasted breath. He watched. He calculated. He stored things away. Within months, he was transferred to the Royal Military Academy at Brienne-le-Château in the cold, flat plains of Champagne. He would spend 6 years there, 6 long years of a particular and grinding loneliness. He was not wealthy enough to dress as the other boys dressed. He was not French enough to speak as they spoke. He did not carry the easy, inherited confidence of Parisian privilege. What he had, instead, was something quieter, and in the long run far more dangerous. He had time, and he filled every hour of it with books. History was his obsession. He read the campaigns of Alexander, tracing the movements of armies across ancient maps with a concentration that bordered on hunger. He read Caesar. He read Hannibal. He read Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose methodical and decisive approach to strategy would leave a permanent mark on how he thought about war. Mathematics he pursued with the same ferocious intensity, not because he was instructed to, but because in numbers, in geometry, in the precise and indifferent language of calculation, he found something the social world of Brienne denied him entirely: fairness. The theorem did not care where you were born. The equation did not mock your accent. And then there was artillery. In the late 18th century, artillery was considered by many traditional officers a lesser branch of the military, the unglamorous domain of engineers and technicians. The cavalry was where glory lived, where the well-born young men dreamed of riding. But the student from Brienne saw artillery differently. He understood with a precision most officers of his generation would not reach for another decade, that the correct placement of cannon, the mathematical calculation of range, the concentration of fire at a single vulnerable point, could determine the outcome of an engagement before a single infantryman had drawn his sword. Graduated from Brienne in 1784 and completed the standard 2-year program at the École Militaire in Paris in a single year. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery in September of 1785. He was 15 years old, lean, sharp-featured, with long dark hair and eyes that already had the quality of a man perpetually measuring something. He knew with the quiet certainty of someone who has had nothing else to hold on to exactly what he wanted. What he could not know was that the world he had been trained to serve was about to disappear entirely. The French Revolution arrived in 1789 like a fracture through stone that had been settling for 100 years. The inequality between estates, the crushing taxation of the poor, the immense distance between the court at Versailles and the hunger of the streets. When it broke all at once. The Bastille fell on the 14th of July. The old certainties of crown and clergy dissolved into fire, and the slow, terrible grind of the guillotine. The King, Louis XVI, was executed in January of 17, 90-3 dot, the aristocratic order that had mocked the boy from Corsica for his accent, and his poverty was being dismantled stone by stone, and the young artillery officer was still there, still watching, still calculating. He returned to Corsica several times during these years, drawn into the island's volatile revolutionary politics. He aligned himself with the Corsican nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli, but the alliance fractured bitterly. By the summer of 1793, Paoli's forces had declared the Bonaparte family enemies of Corsica. Their house in Ajaccio was ransacked. They fled to the mainland as refugees. The island he had been born on had expelled him. France, the country that had once mocked him, was now the only home he had left. He returned to a republic at war on every frontier and consuming itself from within. In the south, the great port of Toulon had been betrayed. Royalist factions had opened the harbor to the British fleet. The enemy now rode at anchor in one of France's most vital ports. The Republican forces assembled to retake the city were in disorder, commanders quarreling, resources desperately thin. And then the officer commanding the Republican artillery was wounded in battle, and a replacement was needed quickly. A young officer was assigned to the post. He was 24 years old. His name was Bonaparte. He assessed the situation at Toulon with the cold, methodical clarity he had applied to theorems since Brienne. He understood immediately that the contest was not about the city itself. It was about the harbor, and the key to the harbor was a promontory called L'Aiguillette, from which well-positioned artillery could bring the anchored British fleet directly under fire. If the guns could be placed there, the British would have no choice but to withdraw. He argued for his plan with an intensity that unnerved the senior officers around him. He requisitioned cannon from depots across the region. He organized the construction of batteries himself, working in the mud and rain alongside the soldiers, earning their respect with his presence among them. During one close engagement near the forward positions, a bayonet thrust opened a wound in his left thigh. He continued working. The assault on the heights was launched in the pre-dawn darkness of the 17th and 18th of December, 1793. Republican infantry stormed the promontory. The guns were brought forward. By morning, the cannon of the Republic looked down upon the British fleet from precisely the position the young Corsican officer had identified, argued for, and fought toward. The British ships withdrew. By the end of December, Toulon was back in Republican hands. Within weeks, the young officer was promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old, and now, as the mind softens towards sleep, let us sit with one quiet, unhurried thought. Consider this young man, this outsider, this boy who spoke with the wrong accent, who wore clothes that were not fine enough, who had been exiled from the island of his birth and arrived on the mainland with nothing but his mind and his will. He had just in the cold mud of a besieged Mediterranean port proven every doubter wrong. He had bent a military campaign to a single idea, and the idea had worked. But here's the question that lingers in the quiet. When a man who has been excluded and driven from his home is finally handed the machinery of power, what is it he reaches for? Does he reach with grateful hands for the ideals the revolution proclaimed in its first bright days? Liberty, equality, the dignity of the common citizen? Or does he reach for something older and more private and far more difficult to name? The sudden, intoxicating recognition of being right, of being seen, of rising at last against the forces that had tried for so long to hold him down. The boy from Ajaccio was now a general. He had tasted glory for the first time, and some fires once kindled in the cold and the loneliness of exile have never in all of human history been content to stay small. There is a particular kind of man who, even at rest, seems to be in motion, a man whose mind never truly pauses, whose ambitions turn like gears behind dark, watchful eyes. Napoleon Bonaparte, in the early months of 1796, was 26 years old, and the world was beginning to feel the first tremors of what he intended to make of it. Paris, that winter, was a city of candlelight and whispered ambition. The Directory, that tired, corrupt government of 5 men who had replaced the Terror, held power loosely, like sand through aging fingers, and in the warm salons of that city, Napoleon had found something he had not expected, something that, for perhaps the only sustained moment of his life, moved entirely beyond his control. Her name was Josephine de Beauharnais. She was 32 years old, a widow born in Martinique with 2 children and a quality of ease unlike anything in Napoleon's experience. She had survived the revolution, had watched her first husband die beneath the guillotine. She had known poverty and real fear, and yet she moved through rooms as though none of it had touched her, warm, unhurried, with a luminous calm that undid Napoleon's famous composure entirely. He who had spent his young life calculating every angle, every advantage, every possible outcome, was simply, helplessly overwhelmed. He wrote to her constantly. The letters tumbled out breathless and unguarded, the handwriting cramped and urgent as though his hand could not keep pace with the torrent inside him. She was fond of him, genuinely so. But Josephine understood that fondness and obsession are not the same thing. They married on the 9th of March, 1796, in a plain civil ceremony. It was late in the evening. A notary read the documents. Few witnesses attended. 2 days later, Napoleon was gone. The army of Italy awaited him. What Napoleon found at his new command, in the wind-swept frontier between France and the Ligurian Alps, was not quite an army. It was a gathering of men who resembled soldiers the way cold ash resembles fire. They were hungry. Their boots had worn through. Their pay was months in arrears. Their morale was a sullen, weathered bitterness, the kind that settles into the bones of men forgotten by the Republic. They were told they were defending. The senior officers were skeptical. This thin, pale Corsican with the strange accent and the extravagant self-belief. Some were older than he was. Who was this 26-year-old to lead them? Napoleon read this immediately. He had always possessed a remarkable gift, not merely for strategy, but for reading the human landscape with the same precision he brought to a military map. He understood that an army without belief is simply a crowd with weapons, and so before he moved a single division, he spoke to them. He rode out on a gray morning before the ragged thousands assembled below the Alps, and he told them what he saw when he looked at them. Not hunger, not rags, not defeat. He told them he saw soldiers, men who had endured what would have broken softer men. He told them what lay ahead, the rich plains of northern Italy, the prosperous cities of an ancient civilization, and that these forgotten men, would be the ones to claim it all. It was a kind of alchemy. The same men who had shuffled in bitterness became, almost overnight, something different, not merely willing, eager. And then Napoleon showed them what eager men, properly led, could accomplish. The Italian campaign of 1796 was one of the most astonishing feats of military execution in recorded history. In the space of weeks, Napoleon had not merely won battles. He had transformed the concept of warfare itself. Speed was his weapon, not just the speed of marching, but the speed of decision. Where other generals hesitated, weighed options, delayed, Napoleon chose, moved, and was already in the next position before the enemy processed the blow that preceded it. At Montenot. In April, he shattered the link between Austrian and Piedmontese forces in a single afternoon. At Millesimo, Dego, Seva, Mondove, the strikes came so rapidly that Piedmont sued for armistice within 2 weeks. It was not simply that he was winning. It was the manner of it, something unprecedented that left opponents not just defeated but bewildered, as though the agreed-upon rules of war had been quietly changed. At Lodi, on the 10th of May, a legend was forged. The Austrian rearguard held a narrow wooden bridge over the Adda River, cannon loaded and aimed down the crossing. Any sober calculation would have counseled patience, a flanking move, delay. Napoleon ordered a frontal charge directly into the guns, helped drag artillery into position along the river bank himself, then sent his men screaming across the bridge. The Austrians broke. That evening, Napoleon sat alone with a thought that would permanently change him. Lodi was the night he grasped something deeper, that he might, in fact, be a man of destiny. His soldiers had begun calling him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, an affectionate name that bridged the vast distance between a general and his men. He accepted it with something unreadable in his eyes. At Arcole in November, he seized a regimental flag and led a charge himself onto a narrow causeway under direct fire. At Rivoli, in January of 1797, he executed a defensive maneuver of breathtaking complexity, destroying a larger Austrian force attempting to relieve the besieged fortress of Mantua. When Mantua fell, the Austrian grip on northern Italy had collapsed. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October of 1797, sealed France's sweeping gains. Napoleon dictated its terms himself. Not the Directory, not the Foreign Ministry in Paris. Him. Alone, he was 28 years old, but Egypt was something else. Something harder to place inside ordinary ambition. In the spring of 1798, Napoleon argued to the Directory that Britain could not be invaded directly. The Royal Navy was too powerful, the Channel too treacherous. But if France were to seize Egypt, to plant itself at the crossroads of 3 continents, the blow to British commerce and influence would be enormous. And beyond strategy, there were the ruins. The ancient world preserved in sand, waiting. The expedition sailed in May. 38,000 soldiers and 167 scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers. This was not merely a campaign. It was an act of civilizational ambition, the Battle of the Pyramids, on the 21st of July, 1798, was swift and overwhelming. Napoleon's forces met the Mamluk cavalry in the shadow of the great monuments of Giza. Soldiers, he said as they formed their squares, from the heights of those pyramids 40 centuries looked down upon you. The Mamluks broke within hours. Cairo fell, Then came the catastrophe on the water. On the 1st of August, British Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Ajaccio Bay and destroyed it, almost entirely. In a single night, France lost her ships, her supply lines, and her means of retreat. The army in Egypt was no longer an expeditionary force. It was a garrison. Stranded. Napoleon pushed north into Syria. He besieged the fortress of Acre and failed, his only siege failure, a wound he would quietly carry. Plague moved through his ranks. The desert worked on his men in ways that cannon fire had not. And yet the scholars kept working, cataloging temples, drawing statues, tracing hieroglyphs no living European could yet read. Near Rosetta, they found a flat stone inscribed in 3 scripts, one of which was Greek. That stone would eventually unlock the entire written language of ancient Egypt. The campaign was failing. The science was making history. In the autumn of 1799, Napoleon received word from France. The Directory was collapsing. The country was exhausted and fractured. His moment was arriving. He left quietly, slipping aboard a ship with a small entourage and sailing home. He was 29 years old. He was about to become something the world had not yet found a name for. And here, in the long pause between the desert and whatever came next, there is a question worth holding slowly in the dark. When Napoleon stood before those pyramids, those impossible, silent monuments that had outlasted every empire the ancient world produced, did he understand that something enormous was happening to his own story? The pharaohs had believed themselves gods. The memory of them had outlasted their empires, their languages, their very names by thousands of years. And here stood this young man from a small island, 29 years old, already the subject of paintings and whispered legends, already a name spoken with a different weight than ordinary names carried. Is it possible to stand beneath 40 centuries of accumulated human ambition and not feel your own name beginning to grow large inside you? And if that certainty hardens in the chest, what does it do to a general, a husband, a human being, to believe that history is not something that happens to you, but something you are actively, deliberately making? Perhaps it makes him magnificent. Perhaps it makes him something more dangerous than he has yet shown the world. Perhaps, standing in the ancient silence beneath the stars above the Nile, it makes him both things at once, and he cannot yet see the difference between them. Rest now. Let the desert wind move across the dunes in the dark. Let the stars burn cold and steady in their ancient courses, as they burned for the pharaohs, as they burned for the young general who stood in their shadow and quietly, inevitably began to compare himself to them. Let the warm darkness come. He had sailed away from Egypt in secret in the quiet gray of an early autumn morning, leaving behind an army that could not follow him. The year was 1799. Napoleon Bonaparte was 29 years old. The pyramids were behind him now, and the vast burning sands, and the failed siege walls of Acre, and the wreckage of his fleet at Ajaccio Bay. He had learned, in the silence of those desert nights, that even the most extraordinary mind cannot conquer everything. Geography and disease and the indifferent sea are older forces than any general. And so he came home. France greeted him not as a failure, but as a hero. In the years between 1793 and 1799, he had become something larger than a general. He had become a symbol, and symbols are not judged by the precise ledger of victories and defeats. They are judged by what people need to believe. France, in the autumn of 1799, needed desperately to believe in something. The government that had ruled since the end of the Terror, the five-man executive body known as the Directory, had collapsed inward on itself like a building with rotten foundations. It was corrupt, exhausted, and despised. Wars dragged on at every border. The treasury was hollow. The streets of Paris hummed with the anxious murmur of a people who had already lived through one revolution and were not entirely certain they had survived it. Into this fractured, gasping city Napoleon returned, the coup that history records under the cold name of 18 Brumaire, the 8th of November, 1799, was not a clean or elegant operation. It was improvised, tense, and very nearly failed entirely. Standing before the Council of 500 in the Palace of St. Cloud, Napoleon was physically grabbed and shoved by furious deputies who screamed that he was an outlaw, a traitor to the Republic. His brother Lucien, presiding over the assembly, broke protocol and called the soldiers inside. Napoleon stumbled into the corridor, pale and shaken, a thin cut bleeding on his cheek. For one long, uncertain moment, the most brilliant military mind of the age looked like a frightened young man. But the soldiers came. The deputies scattered into the November night. By the gray dawn of the 9th, the Directory was finished. In its place stood a new executive body called the Consulate. At its head stood Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of the French Republic. He was 30 years old. What followed was the most concentrated display of administrative energy in the history of modern governance. Napoleon slept 5 or 6 hours a night, sometimes less. He worked in the early morning before his household woke, in carriages between campaigns, in his study at the Tuileries while Paris slept below the windows. His mind moved not only across the topography of battlefields, but across the architecture of entire societies. In 1800, he established the Bank of France, a stable institution to regulate credit, control inflation, and breathe life back into an economy strangled by a decade of revolution and war. He rebuilt roads. He restructured the tax system. He organized France into departments, each governed by a prefect who answered directly to him. The administrative system he created in those years is, in many of its essential outlines, the structure of French governance today. He understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had watched 2 governments collapse beneath him, that power built on nothing but a sword is always won. Bad battle from oblivion. And then there was the Code, the Napoleonic Code, formally promulgated in 1804, was in many ways his truest monument. For centuries, France had been a patchwork of contradictory legal customs, so varied that the same act could result in execution in one province and a small fine in another. Napoleon gathered the finest legal scholars in France and sat with them himself, asking sharp questions, demanding clarity wherever he found obscurity. The result was a coherent body of civil law enshrining equality before the law, the security of private property, and the abolition of feudal privilege. It spread through conquest and influence to Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Spain, and beyond to Louisiana, Quebec, and the legal foundations of Latin America. Napoleon said later, from exile, that his code would outlast all his victories. He was not wrong, but the soldier in him could not rest. In the spring of 1800, he led his army across the Alps, the great St. Bernard Pass, in May. His ice and altitude and a cold that settles into the lungs like stone. Napoleon crossed on a mule, not the magnificent white charger of the famous painting. The artillery was disassembled and dragged through the snowdrifts and hollowed-out pine logs. Men stumbled, animals collapsed, and the army moved forward. He was moving against the Austrian forces that had reconquered northern Italy during his absence in Egypt. On the 14th of June, 1800, on the flat, sun-baked fields outside the village of Marengo in Piedmont, the battle went badly from its opening hours. Austria struck hard and early. By afternoon, the French center was in serious retreat, and Austrian commanders were already composing their victory dispatches. Then Desaix came, back General Louis-Charles Desaix, sent with his division to watch another road, heard the thunder of the guns and turned his men around without orders. He arrived at the crumbling French line in the late afternoon and launched an immediate counterattack. The Austrians, convinced of their victory, had broken their own formations to pursue. Desaix struck them in disorder. The French surged forward. Austrian General Zach was captured. The Austrian line shattered. Desaix himself was killed by a musket ball in the chest during those final desperate minutes, never knowing the day had been saved. But the field belonged to France. Marengo was rough, nearly disastrous, and salvaged as much by fortune and a dead man's courage as by Napoleon's own design. He knew this clearly, but the political consequence was absolute. Austria signed an armistice. Northern Italy returned to French control. Napoleon came back to Paris as an invincible general. His grip on power became unbreakable. In 1802, the Peace of Amiens brought a brief truce with Britain. Napoleon was named consul for life. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. On the 2nd of December, 1804, inside the ancient cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, in the presence of Pope Pius VII, who had traveled all the way from Rome, and before an assembly of marshals, senators, and the watching world, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned. Emperor of the French. Notre Dame had been redecorated at staggering expense in imperial crimson and gold. The painter David was commissioned to record every detail. Josephine was present in white and gold, her dark eyes calm and watchful. The Pope sat in his ancient ceremonial chair, having come this long distance to confer divine blessing upon a man born the son of a minor Corsican lawyer. And then Napoleon reached forward and took the crown from the hands of the pontiff. He did not wait for it to be placed upon his head. He lifted the laurel wreath and set it upon his own brow. Then he took the smaller crown and placed it gently upon the kneeling head of Josephine. The message required no translation. No earthly authority, not even the representative of God on earth, would be named the source of his power. His power came from himself, from his own genius, from the will of the people whose cheers rose inside. That cold stone nave like a wave against an ancient shore. He was 35 years old. The boy who had been mocked at Brienne for his accent and his poverty was now Emperor of the French. He walked out of Notre Dame into the gray Paris winter, wearing a crown that no other hand had placed upon his head. And here let us pause together in this quiet night, and sit with the weight of what has just been described. What possesses a man who saved a republic to dress himself in the heavy purple velvet of emperors. The cynical answer is simple ambition. The romantic answer says he simply grew too large for any frame the Republic could provide. Neither is fully honest. Napoleon did not despise the ideals of the Revolution. He carried some of them to the end of his life. The code, the meritocracy, the abolition of feudal privilege, these were real convictions. He believed in them, and yet he sat upon a throne. He placed crowns on his brothers' heads. He recreated, with full self-awareness, the very court ritual and imperial ceremony of the monarchies his revolution had destroyed. Perhaps the most honest answer is uncomfortable. Perhaps there arrives in the life of a person of extraordinary ability a moment when the institutions of their time cannot contain what they believe must be done. At that moment, a quiet choice appears at the end of a long corridor. Accept constraint, or remake the institution around yourself. Napoleon always remade. He could not help it. It was woven into the essential, unstoppable nature of him. But the question the coronation raises does not go away. Is the ultimate destination of absolute merit simply absolute monarchy? Does every person who reaches the outermost summit of human achievement eventually decide that no law was quite written to contain someone like them? If so, Napoleon was neither monster nor saint. He was the most extreme and luminous example of a very human temptation. The temptation to stop asking permission. The candles of Notre Dame threw long, trembling shadows across the ancient stone that December morning, and the new emperor of the French walked out into the cold winter air, into a world that would never again be exactly what it had been before. The gray Paris winter had settled over the Seine like a held breath. The year 1805 arrived not with the softness of new beginnings, but with the low, inevitable rumble of drums. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was 36 years old, and the world was not yet finished with him, nor he with it. Europe had watched the coronation. Europe had made its calculations, and Europe, afraid and certain in equal measure, was moving its armies. The third coalition had formed in the cold months following the crowning. Austria and Russia, ancient and powerful, had aligned themselves against the new emperor, drawing the old monarchies together in a shared conviction that this Corsican upstart in his purple robes must be stopped before his ambition swallowed every throne on the continent. Britain, ever watchful from its island fortress, had poured gold into the alliance. The armies were marching. Napoleon understood the mathematics of war with a clarity few men in history have possessed. He knew that a coalition enemy operating across vast distances, communicating slowly, commanding armies of different languages and different loyalties was a fragile and dangerous thing, but also a thing that could be shattered if struck at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right place. He gave the order. The Grande Armée, over 200,000 veterans honed by years of Italian and Rhenish campaigning, moved east with astonishing speed. He met the Austrian army at Ulm in October, encircling nearly 40,000 soldiers without a major pitched battle, forcing their surrender through pure maneuver. It was a masterpiece of logistics and deception, but it was only the prelude. The true reckoning waited to the east. On the cold plains of Moravia, the 2nd of December, 1805, was a date Napoleon would speak of for the rest of his life with a quiet, almost reverential pride. It was the first anniversary of his coronation. It was also the morning of Austerlitz. The night before had been extraordinary. Napoleon had walked among his troops in the darkness, wrapped in a plain gray overcoat, lantern light catching the mud on his boots. The soldiers had recognized him. They had torn straw from their caps and set it alight, thousands of torches igniting, one after another, across the hillsides, a spontaneous and magnificent gesture of loyalty. He had wept, not from weakness, but because in that moment he understood, with complete and humbling clarity, that these men would follow him into the earth itself at dawn. A thick winter fog clung to the valley. The combined Russian and Austrian armies, led in part by Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis II, had concentrated their strength on Napoleon's right flank, believing it to be weak, believing he intended to retreat. It was precisely what he had arranged for them to believe. When the fog began to lift, it was already too late. He had deliberately thinned his right and held the Pratzen Heights lightly, inviting the Allied assault. Then, at the critical moment, he sent his finest infantry corps straight up the slope into the enemy's exposed center. The Allied line split like dry timber. French cavalry poured through the breach. Within hours, the great coalition army was broken, its survivors fleeing across the frozen ponds of Sichuan, the ice cracking beneath them, men and horses and artillery disappearing into the black water below Dot by afternoon. It was over. 26,000 Allied soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed weeks later, dismantled Austrian power in Central Europe and forced Francis to acknowledge French dominance from the Rhine to the Adriatic. Napoleon rode the frozen field that evening as the last light faded, quiet among the dead, and a soldier who saw him there said he looked not triumphant, but deeply, profoundly calm, as though he had always known it would end this way. And so the empire expanded. Kingdoms and principalities fell into his orbit like planets drawn toward a new sun. He dissolved the ancient Holy Roman Empire, a structure 1,000 years old, replacing it with the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states bound to French interests. He placed his brother Joseph on the throne of Naples. His brother Louis became King of Holland. His brother-in-law Joachim Murat collected grand duchies like a man collecting debts. Napoleon was not merely remaking Europe's borders. He was installing Bonaparte blood within them, weaving his own family into the fabric of continental governance as though building a dynasty that could outlast any single battle against Britain, which his navy could not reach after the catastrophic defeat at Trafalgar in October of 1805. He deployed economics as a weapon. The continental system declared in Berlin in 1806 was his answer. All ports under French control were to be closed to British trade. Britain was to be strangled, her merchants ruined, her treasury bled dry. The plan was elegant, logical, and in practice deeply flawed. It required the cooperation of every European port and every European government, and its constant, grinding enforcement would become a weight Napoleon, never fully set down. Then came the grief that had nothing to do with war. He had known for years. Josephine, his Josephine, the beautiful, exasperating, unfaithful, irreplaceable Josephine had not given him a child. She was past the age of bearing, and Napoleon, emperor, needed an heir, not for vanity, for continuation. By continuation, for every code and every battle and every kingdom rearranged. Without an heir, the empire ended with him, and the thought was intolerable. The divorce was enacted in December of 1809. They had been together for 13 years. She had been his first great obsession, the woman to whom he had written letters of volcanic, almost embarrassing passion from every campaign. Now he sat across from her in the cold formality of an imperial salon, and the words were spoken, and it was done. She wept. He wept. He arranged for her to keep Malmaison, her beloved chateau, and a generous income, because even in separation he could not entirely release her. He married Marie Louise of Austria in the spring of 1810. She was 18 years old, the daughter of the very emperor he had humiliated at Austerlitz. It was a strategic union, a diplomatic masterstroke designed to bind the Habsburgs to his dynasty. And in 1811 she gave him a son, Napoleon Francis Joseph, the King of Rome. The heir was born. And Napoleon, they say, held the infant with a tenderness that surprised even those closest to him. But in the West, something had already begun to bleed. In 1808, Napoleon had made the gravest political error of the middle years of his reign. He had invaded Spain. The Iberian Peninsula was a geopolitical irritant, a kingdom whose royal family he distrusted and whose compliance with the continental system was unreliable. In a sequence of moves combining cynical manipulation with shocking misjudgment, he had forced the Spanish Bourbons to abdicate and placed his brother Joseph upon the throne in Madrid. The Spanish people, who had not been consulted, responded with a fury that would burn for 6 years. It began in Madrid on the 2nd of May, 1808. A popular uprising, brutal and spontaneous, was suppressed by French cavalry with extraordinary violence. The images of what followed, the executions carried out by torchlight in the early hours of the 3rd of May, would be captured decades later by Francisco Goya in paint, and would become among the most haunting records of what Napoleonic conquest looked like from the receiving end. The guerrilla war that spread across Spain was unlike anything the Grande Army had been trained to fight. There were no set-piece battles to be won by superior maneuver. There was no capital to capture, and no government to sign a treaty of surrender. There were instead thousands of small bands of fighters, moving through mountain passes and olive groves, destroying supply lines, ambushing patrols, vanishing into terrain that swallowed French soldiers whole. And behind them stood the British Army under the steady, meticulous hand of Arthur Wellesley, supplying the resistance, anchoring a Portuguese front, and slowly, methodically, grinding the French position down. Napoleon said it himself later. He called Spain his ulcer, and ulcers do not surrender. They drain. Here is the weight of what this chapter asks us to carry. When a leader reshapes the map of the world to fit his own family, placing his blood on foreign thrones and drawing borders to mirror his ambition, does he build an eternal dynasty or a fragile house of cards? Each card dependent entirely on the continued genius of the hand that placed it. The kingdoms Napoleon gave to his brothers required Napoleon to defend them. The continental system Napoleon imposed required Napoleon to police it. The war in Spain that had begun under his orders could only end with his personal attention. Every expansion had multiplied not just his power, but his obligations. Every throne bestowed had created a new vulnerability. He was, by 1809, not merely an emperor. He was the single load-bearing wall of an enormous and increasingly unstable structure. And even the most brilliant architects are not immortal. The summer of 1812 arrived like a held breath before a storm. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, commander of the Grande Armée, stood at the edge of the known world and decided to cross it. He was 42 years old. His face had grown fuller, the sharp angles of youth softened by decades of command and sleepless nights. But his eyes were the same, dark, calculating, burning with the certainty that all things could be bent to his will. If only the will were strong enough, Russia would be different. He sensed this, and yet he did not truly know it. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of the empire. A breathing machine of war stretching across the Polish plains in an unbroken column that took days simply to pass a single point on the road. They crossed the Niemen River in June, and the Russian Empire swallowed them whole. Without a sound, the Russians did not fight. Not at first. They retreated. They burned their own crops and scorched their own villages. They drew the Grande Armée deeper into the interior, a vast, hungry beast lured into a maze with no center. The summer heat was punishing. Supply lines snapped like old thread. Men fell not from bullets, but from thirst, from dysentery, from the relentless cruelty of distance. At Borodino in September, on a wide field outside Moscow, the Russians finally stood and fought with a ferocity born of knowing what lay behind them. Their home, their soil, their ancestors. The battle lasted a single apocalyptic day. Tens of thousands fell on both sides. Napoleon held his imperial guard in reserve, unwilling to commit his final weapon, even as his generals begged. The Russians withdrew, battered but unbroken, and Napoleon won, a victory that felt strangely like a wound. He entered Moscow in September. The ancient city was nearly empty, and then it began to burn. Whether by Russian patriots or accident, Moscow set itself alight and burned for days. Napoleon sat in the Kremlin, watching the orange glow on the horizon, waiting for a peace offer that never came. He waited 5 weeks. 5 weeks in a burning, hollow city, the autumn cold sharpening the air, his army dissolving as supplies vanished. Alexander of Russia sent nothing. No message. No terms. Only silence, as vast and contemptuous as the steppe itself. And so Napoleon turned his army around. The retreat from Moscow is not a chapter of military history. It is a descent into something older and darker. The winter arrived suddenly, temperatures plunging far below freezing, and the snow came in curtains that swallowed men whole. Soldiers abandoned their weapons because they were too cold to hold them. They burned their wagons for warmth. They ate their horses. They lay down in the snow at night, and many did not rise in the morning. Cossack riders circled like wolves, striking at stragglers. At the Berezina River in November, with Russian armies closing from 3 sides, thousands drowned and thousands froze upon the banks. 600,000 men had crossed the Niemen in June. Perhaps 100,000 returned. The rest were snow. Napoleon had shattered his own instrument. The years that followed moved quickly, as catastrophes always do. 1813 brought a desperate but futile campaign as Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden united against him in the War of the Sixth Coalition. He won battle after battle, this graying, exhausted emperor with his dwindling armies of young conscripts, hollow-cheeked boys marching like shadows of the veterans of Austerlitz. But the victories could not hold. At Leipzig, in October of 1813, in the immense four-day carnage called the Battle of the Nations, the coalition forces overwhelmed him. The empire began to collapse inward. In 1814, they came for France itself. Napoleon fought them across the frozen roads of his own country, winning sharp engagements with an army that was barely an army. His marshals grew weary. Paris fell in March, and in the hall at Fontainebleau, surrounded by generals who would not meet his eyes, he was persuaded to abdicate. He signed the document quietly. The pen scratched against the paper. The Napoleonic era came officially to its end. His first exile was the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean jewel, and Napoleon was made its sovereign. He reformed roads. He reviewed his miniature army. But Elba was never enough. He was 44 years old. The Congress of Vienna was reconstructing the world without him, and whispers from France told him the restored Bourbon king was despised, and that veterans murmured his name at their firesides in the dark. On the 26th of February, 1815, he sailed from Elba with barely 1,000 men. He landed in the south of France and marched north. Louis XVIII dispatched regiment after regiment to stop him. Each regiment, upon reaching Napoleon, went over to him instead. Officers wept, soldiers cheered. By the time he reached Paris, the king had fled, and Napoleon entered the Tuileries without a shot being fired. The 100 Days had begun. He knew, with the cold clarity of a man who has lost everything, that this was likely his final act. Europe mobilized instantly. He had perhaps 2 months before the armies of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia could converge upon France. His only chance was to strike first, to divide them, to win so swiftly that the coalition shattered before it fully assembled. He drove north into Belgium in June of 1815. He won at Ligny, sending the Prussians reeling. But at Waterloo, on the 18th of June, on a low ridge south of Brussels, beneath a gray and dripping summer sky, Wellington held the line. The French attacks surged forward all day and broke. The Imperial Guard advanced at dusk in a final, desperate, magnificent charge, and for the first time in its history, it broke. And then the Prussians arrived on his flank, and the French army dissolved into a rout, men throwing down their weapons and fleeing into the Belgian night. Napoleon sat alone in a farmhouse afterward. The sounds of his army's collapse filtered through the walls like smoke. He abdicated a second time. The British offered no Mediterranean island, no court, and no miniature kingdom. They offered St. Helena, a fortress of volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest continent, encircled on all sides by the gray and indifferent ocean, a place designed with one explicit purpose, to ensure that Napoleon Bonaparte never returned. He arrived in October of 1815. He was 45 years old. He would live there for 6 more years. The island was small, damp, and frequently shrouded in low cloud. Longwood House was poorly ventilated and prone to mold. He complained of Sir Hudson Lowe, the English governor, a petty and suspicious man who treated Napoleon's surveillance as a personal crusade. He took long walks. He tended a small garden. He dictated his memoirs obsessively to his loyal companions, constructing with each word the legend he wished the world to carry. The martyr, the progressive emperor, the man who had only ever sought to give Europe peace and law and civilization. Whether this was truth or the most elaborate myth-making in the modern age is a question without a simple answer. His health declined slowly, then quickly. He grew thin. The heaviness of his imperial years fell away, and what remained was something smaller, more human, more fragile. He spoke of Josephine sometimes, the woman he had divorced for political necessity and never stopped loving. He spoke of his son, the little king of Rome, whom he had not seen since the first abdication and would never see again. On the 5th of May, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon Bonaparte died. The wind moved through the grass of St. Helena, and the island was quiet. He had reshaped the map of the world. He had given Europe its modern legal foundation. He had made kings and unmade them. He had marched 600,000 men into the Russian snow and watched them become ghosts. He had returned from exile on a breath of legend and been broken by the summer rain of a Belgian afternoon dot, and so we arrive at the question this long, quiet journey has always been moving toward, stripped of his crowns, his invincible armies, and his beloved France, staring out at an ocean that offers no answer, that goes on until there is nothing but water and gray sky. Did the conqueror of the world, in those final dim hours on that windswept Atlantic rock, finally understand the limits of human ambition? Was there peace in that room? Or did something in him still burn, even at the very end, a flame in an empty house, consuming nothing but itself? The great question of Napoleon Bonaparte is not how he rose. The rise is comprehensible. Extraordinary talent, iron will, and a world caught in brilliant, terrible upheaval. The question is what it means that he fell, whether the fall was inevitable, whether it was written into his nature from the first taste of glory at Toulon, whether any human being can hold so much power over so many lives without eventually being broken beneath its weight. He leaves us no easy answer. Only the silence of a small island, only the sound of the Atlantic wind moving through the grass, going on and on into the dark. Rest now. Let the kenned fire grow distant and soft. Let the snow of Russia settle into something quiet and far away. Let the old world, beautiful and terrible and endlessly complicated as it was, sleep. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day.